Honourable Peter Dunn.
Mr Speaker, the best way to create a sustainable economy that deals with poverty, that deals with disadvantage, that gives all the things that the previous Speaker and others have said we ought to be providing to people, is to have one that is funded on a sound basis. And the reality is that until this budget, there were real questions raised first by the Tax Working Group and second by some of the actions taken in years gone by that put the long-term viability of our tax base at risk. Let me give the House an example. With the benefit of hindsight, what some of us suspected at the time to be true has been proven to be correct. The most disastrous tax decision in the last decade was the previous government's decision to hike the top tax rate in December 1999. The consequence of that has been as follows. We've seen a huge explosion in the use of trusts for income sheltering purposes. And the calculation has been that that move alone, driven by that differential in the tax rate, has cost the revenue around $300 million a year. That's $2.7 billion over the last decade as a consequence of that policy shift. But it gets worse. A lot's been said about LAQCs and how they have become another diversionary tactic along the way. The growth in LAQCs in the same period has been over 240%. We now have something in the order of 130,000 LAQCs in New Zealand. The value of their tax losses is now $2.3 billion, 400% higher than it was at the start of the decade. So, Mr Speaker, if you put those two figures together, you can draw the reasonable conclusion that the net consequence of Labor's hiking of the top tax rate in 1999 has been a $5 billion revenue hole for the New Zealand taxpayer. And then the Speaker who preceded me talks about why we aren't doing more to alleviate poverty. I'd love to do more to alleviate poverty. I'd love to give a bigger boost to child health. But when you've got a $5 billion hole to fill, it becomes a little difficult. And it gets worse, because if you heard the Leader of the Opposition this afternoon, what he's proposing to do is actually restore the hole. He's opposed to the cut in the top tax rate. He's going to restore it back to what it was, set the whole process off again. And if you heard him again, and also the co-leader of the Greens, coming in alongside that is a capital gains tax. So here we have the situation, Mr Speaker, where this side of the House says this budget is all doom and gloom. It's terrible. People are going to be punished, etc., etc. Vote for us. You get the top tax rate going up, you get a $5 billion hole in your revenue, and you get a capital gains tax as well. Mr Speaker, that's what doesn't add up. That's what doesn't make sense. And may I just say to those who advocate a capital gains tax, because it's efficient. Well, it's efficient in the sense that it captures just about everything, but it's not efficient in terms of producing revenue. I heard the Greens say the other day that with the $4.5 billion that you gain from a capital gains tax, you could do all sorts of marvellous things. A couple of points about that, sir. That's probably over about a 10-year period, because it assumes that assets are moving all at the same time, and actually at about a maximum of $450 million a year. It's not the huge windfall that people make it out to be. Mr Speaker, what we have as a result of the tax package in this budget is a dramatic change in the arrangements that will affect the average New Zealand family. For nearly three-quarters of taxpayers in New Zealand, as a result of this budget's changes, their maximum tax rate will be 17.5%. That, sir, compares more than favourably with any other jurisdiction that we like to compare ourselves with. We also see a package which supposedly gives more to the rich, but actually two-thirds of the cost of the package is dedicated to lowering the bottom two rates of tax. And those rates of decrease are greater than the rates of decrease for the higher rates of tax. So, Mr Speaker, we are seeing a significant shift. Now, let's talk about the GST increase. Yes, it does go up to 15% from the 1st of October. Let's contrast that with what happened the last time GST raised, and I was part of the government that did that too. But unlike then, unlike now, then GST was raised with 6 weeks' notice. 6 weeks' notice and no compensation. So when you talk about people being adversely affected by a change that's now 3.5 months away, with compensation and tax cuts on the day it comes into force, and then compare that to 6 weeks' change, no compensation, Mr. Speaker, I think it's reasonable to draw a conclusion about who's better off as a consequence. And I'm particularly pleased that in the changes that will take effect from the 1st of October, there will be full compensation for those contributors to the Government Superannuation Fund and the National Provident Fund as well, because they've often been a group that's missed out in the past when tax changes have occurred, and I'm pleased that they're going to be addressed in the context of this budget. So there you have it, sir, a budget that makes some significant changes in the disposition of taxes, and it does give people more ability to make some choices for themselves about how they spend their income. And surely that is a reasonable proposition. Some may well spend more on food than others. That is a matter of choice. Some may well choose to do other things. Again, it is a matter of choice as to how one spends one income. Now, Mr. Speaker, we've heard the suggestion opposite, that one way of compensating people for an increase in the GST would be to take fresh fruit and vegetables out of the mix. Well, let's just have a look at that, Mr. Speaker. It's a very arbitrary consideration. It's probably about $150 million to do. But, Mr. Speaker, there are practical problems about how it will apply. Most retailers operate their GST return off their cash register returns. So, for a start, every cash register in New Zealand would have to be recalibrated to take out a fresh fruit or vegetable item. So there's going to be a growing industry in that respect. Also, Mr. Speaker, there is no account taken of the input costs that would be claiming a GST refund to produce those tax-free items. And it's so arbitrary that other unprocessed items like meat, poultry, fish, eggs would somehow be in the tax net but not fresh fruit and vegetables. And, Mr. Speaker, one's only got to look at what happened in Australia when this was tried, and the great example of John Hewson and Paul Keating and the ham sandwich. The ham by itself was exempt GST, the bread by itself would be exempt GST, the sandwich is subject to GST. That's what the Labor Party is proposing to give us as an alternative to a very clear and straightforward system where everyone ends up better off as a result of these changes than they were beforehand. That is the line that cannot be surpassed. And, Mr. Speaker, it's interesting to assess what the public reaction to this has been. At the lock-up this morning, in the various media commentaries subsequent to the presentation of the budget, there has been a generally favourable reaction, and it comes around two key points. Firstly, there has been surprise at the extent of the movement on the lower two tax rates. People did not expect as big a reduction, and they certainly did not expect the move to reduce the company tax rate. Both of those things are positive for New Zealand. They certainly boost our competitiveness. They certainly make it easier for those New Zealanders contemplating a shift offshore to make the choice to stay here. They position our economy well for the future in terms of the uptake that will come from the international recovery. They position our economy well with respect to our traditional major partner and competitor, Australia. And they send a very clear signal to New Zealanders that what we are about is a better, fairer tax system that removes the distortions that have nobbled it for a long time, that gets away from the envy politics that have actually made it more difficult to deliver quality policies in terms of the areas of traditional concern of members opposite. So, Mr. Speaker, this is a good budget. It doesn't do all the dastardly things that were predicted for it. It does a lot of positive good for New Zealand families, and, Mr. Speaker, I suspect it will be well welcomed and positively accepted.